Somewhere on YouTube right now, there is almost certainly a video with a title telling you that artificial intelligence has finally cracked one of the coldest cases in Russian history. Dyatlov Pass, solved by AI, and it's worse than we thought. It is a great headline. There is just one problem with it. No AI solved this case. There's no neural network, no machine learning model, no chatbot that sat down with 65-year-old case files and spat out an answer nobody had thought of before. What actually happened is stranger and, honestly, more impressive than that. A pair of engineers used physics, snow science, and of all things, animation techniques borrowed from a Disney movie to reconstruct the last hour of 9 people's lives with a level of precision nobody thought was possible. So let's tell the real story, because the real story does not need to be inflated. It is already one of the strangest, saddest, most thoroughly investigated mysteries of the 20th century, and the actual ending is more unsettling than anything a headline about AI could promise you. In the dead of a Ural winter with 10 young hikers from the Ural Polytechnic Institute setting out on what was, by the standards of the time, an extremely serious expedition. This was not a casual weekend trip. Soviet hiking culture in the 1950s ran on a strict grading system, and the route this group had planned, roughly 200 miles through the northern Urals in the harshest part of winter, climbing 2 mountains along the way, was rated at the highest level of difficulty that existed. To even attempt it, you needed to be experienced, disciplined, and comfortable with real risk. The group's leader was a 23-year-old engineering student named Igor Dyatlov, sharp, well-liked, and careful enough that the expedition would eventually be named after him. Alongside him were 8 other experienced skiers and mountaineers, 7 men and 2 women, most in their early 20s, one considerably older, a war veteran in his late 30s who had joined somewhat late and somewhat unexpectedly. 10 set out. One turned back early, sick, and by sheer chance of a stomach illness, that decision saved his life. He would spend the rest of his own life as the only member of the group who ever came home. The remaining 9 kept going. They planned to reach a distant peak, complete their route, and be back in touch by a certain date in mid-February. When that date came and went with no word, nobody panicked immediately. Delays happened. But as the days stretched on, worry turned into something more serious, and search parties, volunteers, and eventually the military went out into the mountains to find them. It is worth pausing on who these 9 people actually were, because it is easy, 65 years later, to reduce them to a list of injuries and theories and forget they were, by every account, an unusually close and capable group. Several had skied together for years. Zenaida Kolmogorova was known as one of the strongest and most cheerful members of the club, the kind of person other hikers wanted on a hard route. Lyudmila Dubinina was an engineering student with a reputation for toughness that her male companions respected without qualification. Semyon Zolotaryov, the oldest of the group at 37, was a war veteran and outdoor instructor who had joined this particular expedition somewhat last minute, a detail that decades later would get folded into more than one conspiracy theory about a hidden agenda he supposedly carried into the mountains, despite no evidence that he was anything other than exactly what his record said he was. These were not reckless amateurs wandering into danger. They were among the most experienced winter mountaineers their region produced, which is precisely why what happened to them refused to fit any easy explanation for so long. What the searchers found, when they finally located the group's last campsite in late February, was the first piece of a puzzle that has never fully closed. Locating it at all took weeks. The search that eventually formed was massive by the standards of the time and the terrain, involving military personnel, aircraft, trained volunteers, and local Mountsy guides, who knew the region's weather patterns better than anyone, all working across an enormous stretch of largely trackless winter wilderness where a single mist ridge could hide a campsite for months. The tent was still standing, half buried in the snow, on the slope of a barren mountain the local Mountsy people called Kolat-Syakhl, which in their language means something close to Dead Mountain, a name that existed long before any of this happened and that has haunted the case ever since. The tent had been cut open, not unzipped, not untied. Cut from the inside with a knife in more than one place. Boots were left behind. Warm outer clothing was left behind. Whatever happened inside that tent in the middle of a sub-zero night sent 9 experienced, cold-weather-trained mountaineers slicing their way out through canvas and running out into a blizzard in their socks, in some cases barefoot, rather than take the extra seconds to find their boots by the door. Footprints in the snow, preserved just long enough to be photographed before the weather erased them, showed the group moving away from the tent together, in an orderly line, not scattered, not panicked in the way you'd expect from 9 separate people bolting in 9 separate directions. Whatever drove them out as a unit, walking or half running roughly a mile down toward the tree line, in temperatures that were somewhere around 30 below. The first bodies were found near a large cedar tree at the edge of that tree line. 2 of the young men, in nothing but underwear and socks, dead of hypothermia, with the remains of a small fire burned into the snow beside them, and, disturbingly, broken branches high up on the cedar, well above where a person could reach standing on the ground, suggesting one of them had climbed the tree, possibly to look back toward the tent, possibly to see something, before coming back down. Between the cedar and the tent, searchers found 3 more bodies, including Dyatlov himself, positioned in postures that some investigators read as an attempt to crawl back toward camp. 5 hikers, all dead of exposure, all found within the first weeks of the search. The remaining 4 were not found until May, when the snow finally melted enough to expose a ravine several dozen yards further into the forest. And this is the part of the case that no cold explanation and no easy explanation has ever fully shaken off. These 4 had injuries far beyond frostbite. One had a severely fractured skull. 2 others had massive chest fractures, the kind of blunt force trauma that pathologists at the time compared to the impact of a serious car crash. Forces powerful enough to break multiple ribs and, in one case, essentially crush the chest cavity. And yet none of these injuries came with the external wounds you would expect from that level of force. No large bruising consistent with a beating, no obvious weapon marks, skin largely intact over bones that had been shattered underneath. Something had hit these 4 people with tremendous, focused force, without leaving the kind of marks a fist, a blade, or a blunt object typically leaves. And then there was the detail that, more than any other single fact, is responsible for 65 years of increasingly wild theories. One of the 2 women in the group, found in that ravine, was missing her tongue, her eyes, and portions of the soft tissue of her face and lips. To investigators working without modern forensics tools, in a case already full of things nobody could explain, that single detail was enough to send the whole story spiraling into rumor. Soviet secrecy did the rest. Because this happened in 1959 in a closed military-adjacent region of the USSR, the original case files were classified for over a decade. The official Soviet conclusion, when the case was finally closed in May of 1959, was a single vague phrase that has become almost as famous as the incident itself. The hikers died as a result of a compelling, unknown natural force. That is it. That is the sentence a government put on 9 deaths and then sealed the file. You can imagine what that kind of silence does to a story like this one. Into that vacuum poured every theory you can imagine, and several you probably can't. Soviet secret weapons testing gone wrong, with the group stumbling into range of something the military did not want witnessed. Infrasound, a theory that a particular wind pattern moving across the shape of that mountain could generate sound waves below human hearing that trigger sheer panic and disorientation in anyone nearby. A phenomenon that does have some basis in real acoustics research, even if applying it convincingly to this exact night in this exact terrain has always been more speculative than proven. Attacks by the local Mansai people, a theory that collapsed almost immediately since there was no physical evidence of any outside person at the scene, and the group's own footprints showed no sign of a struggle with anyone else. And one that says considerably more about the prejudices of mid-century Soviet investigators than it ever did about the actual Mansi communities, who had lived alongside that mountain for generations without incident. And, inevitably, once the story reached a wider audience decades later, theories involving cryptids and theories involving extraterrestrial contact, both fueled by scattered reports from other hikers in the region around that time of strange glowing lights in the night sky, lights that were almost certainly related to Soviet missile tests happening at a nearby range around the same dates, tests that were later confirmed to have occurred, though investigators concluded the launch site itself would not have been visible from where the group camped. One detail that kept the more sinister theories alive longer than they probably deserved was radiation. Testing on some of the hikers' clothing years later reportedly showed trace levels of radioactive contamination slightly above background. 2 of the hikers were also found to have some connection to a nuclear facility not far from where a serious radiological accident had occurred just 2 years earlier, in 1957, one of the worst nuclear disasters in history at that point, and one the Soviet government had also kept quiet for years. To a certain kind of internet sleuth, that combination, radiation, secrecy, a nearby nuclear accident, was catnip. But investigators who looked closely never found anything connecting that trace contamination to the deaths themselves, and the levels involved were consistent with ordinary background exposure, common to people who worked around certain industrial and mining environments of that era, not with anything resembling a nuclear incident at the campsite. It did not help that the surrounding region was, and still is, dotted with military and industrial sites the Soviet government preferred nobody discuss, which meant that every gap in the official story, and there were many, got filled in by people's reasonable assumption that a closed, secretive state was hiding something specific, rather than simply being a closed, secretive state by default. For 60 years, that was where things sat. A closed case with an empty explanation, a stack of contradictory physical evidence, and a genuine, unresolved mystery that professional investigators, amateur researchers, journalists, and eventually millions of internet strangers all took a swing at, without anyone producing an answer that explained every piece of the puzzle at once. The case became something close to a national obsession in Russia, the subject of books, documentaries, museum exhibits, and an entire cottage industry of independent researchers who spent decades of their own lives combing through what fragments of the original file had eventually been released, cross-referencing weather records, interviewing surviving family members, and, in some cases, returning to the pass itself year after year, hoping the mountain would finally give something up. That level of sustained attention is part of why the case is so unusually well documented compared to most historical mysteries. There is an enormous amount of real physical evidence here, autopsy reports, photographs, weather data, terrain surveys. The problem was never a shortage of evidence. It was that nobody had a framework rigorous enough to make all of it agree with itself at once. Then, starting in 2015, Russian authorities quietly reopened the case. In 2019, the country's investigative committee announced it had concluded that an avalanche was the most probable cause. A year later, in July of 2020, the Prosecutor General's office, after running its own separate, more public investigation, reached essentially the same conclusion. According to their reconstruction, a sudden shift in weather triggered a small avalanche that struck the tent, and the group, in the chaos and fear that a larger slide might follow, cut their way out and moved away from the site as a unit, eventually succumbing to a combination of hypothermia, disorientation, and blunt trauma from the snow itself. It was a reasonable theory, and it was also immediately controversial for a very specific and very legitimate scientific reason. The slope where the tent had been pitched was measured at somewhere around 15 to 30 degrees, well below the incline you would normally expect an avalanche to release on. Search teams who had combed the area in 1959 found no obvious signs of avalanche debris. And critics, including a separate Swedish-Russian expedition that visited the site in 2019, argued the terrain simply did not fit a classic avalanche scenario, proposing instead that powerful Katabatic winds, the kind of dense, fast-moving cold air that rolls straight down a mountainside, had battered the tent directly and caused the group to flee, without any snowslide involved at all. That expedition camped on the same slope, in the same season, specifically to measure how the local wind behaved, and reported gusts strong enough on their own to explain the panic and the damage to the tent, without needing any avalanche mechanism at all. For a while, the case had two competing official-ish explanations sitting side by side. A government prosecutor backing an avalanche nobody could quite make fit the slope angle, and an independent field team backing wind alone, and neither side had the kind of rigorous, testable model needed to settle the argument. The prosecutor's own avalanche theory, in other words, answered some questions, but left the terrain problem hanging and left the scientific community divided. This is where the real breakthrough happened, and it is worth being precise about what it actually was, because it is far more interesting than an AI headline. In 2021, two engineers, Alexander Puzrin at ETH Zurich and Johann Gaum, who runs the Snow Avalanche Simulation Laboratory at EPFL in Switzerland, published a peer-reviewed study that did not rely on guesswork or historical speculation at all. It relied on physics. Gaum's lab specializes in modeling exactly how snow behaves under stress, work that, in an unusual twist of fate, had previously been used to help animators at Disney simulate realistic snow for the movie Frozen. The same underlying mathematics that made animated snowdrifts look physically convincing on screen turned out to be extraordinarily well suited to modeling something far more serious, the mechanics of how a slab of snow actually breaks apart and moves. Puzrin and Gaum built a detailed model of the slope at Dyatlov Pass, incorporating the specific angle of the terrain, the layering of the snowpack, and a detail almost every previous investigation had overlooked, that the hikers themselves had cut into the slope to create a flat platform for their tent, which is standard. Mountaineering practice, but which also, according to the model, weakened the snow above the site in a very specific way. Combine that human-made cut with a period of strong wind-loading additional snow onto the slope above the tent, and the simulation showed something remarkable, even on a slope too. Shallow for a typical avalanche, that combination could produce a delayed, localized slab release, not a massive roaring wall of snow, but a smaller, dense block, still heavy enough to strike the tent with serious force. Hours after the cut was made, once wind-driven snow had built up just enough weight above it. To test whether that kind of localized slab impact could actually produce injuries like the ones found on the four bodies in the ravine, the team turned to a second, equally unusual data source: decades of biomechanical crash test research originally developed for the automotive industry. Data on exactly how much force it takes to fracture human ribs and skulls under blunt impact, the same kind of research used to design car safety systems. Running their avalanche model against that injury data, they found the forces produced by a small, dense, delayed slab strike lined up convincingly with the specific pattern of trauma the original 1959 autopsies had recorded: severe internal chest and skull fractures, with minimal external bruising, Exactly the puzzling combination that had never made sense to investigators for 6 decades. It also explained why searchers found no dramatic avalanche debris field. A slide this small and localized, on a slope this shallow, could easily be swallowed and disguised by wind and fresh snowfall within days. None of that came from artificial intelligence. It came from combining 3 completely unrelated fields: snow physics, cinema animation software, and automotive crash testing, into one working model. And it happened not through some single dramatic reveal, but through years of fieldwork, 3 separate follow-up expeditions to the site to confirm the team's assumptions about slope angle, snow layering, and wind patterns matched what their simulation required. In their published paper, the 2 researchers were careful, almost unusually careful for scientists who had just cracked a 60-year mystery, not to overclaim. They stated plainly that their model could not explain every detail of the case, only that it offered, for the first time, a physically consistent explanation for the 2 facts that had resisted every previous theory at once: the shallow slope and the severe internal injuries. When journalists later asked whether their work put the whole case to rest, one of the researchers gave an answer that has stuck with the case's long history of asking more than it answers, saying that for years he had assumed his part and the story was finished, only to find himself pulled back into it again and again as new questions kept surfacing, until he eventually stopped promising anyone a final word on it at all. That is what real scientific problem solving actually looks like, and it is a far cry from the version of this story currently circulating with an AI-generated thumbnail attached to it. So does this mean the mystery is finally fully closed? Mostly, but not entirely. And being honest about that gap matters. The slab avalanche model explains the tent damage, the group fleeing without proper clothing, and remarkably, it explains the specific injury pattern on the 4 bodies found in the ravine, which had genuinely resisted explanation for 60 years. What it does not fully explain, and what neither the Russian prosecutor's investigation nor the Swiss engineering team claim to have resolved, is every last detail, including exactly why the group moved as far as they did before some of them, apparently, tried to return, and the precise circumstances behind the missing soft tissue on one of the bodies, which most forensic experts now attribute to natural decomposition and animal activity during the 3 months that body spent partially submerged in a mountain stream before it was recovered. A mundane, unpleasant, but scientifically unremarkable explanation once you understand the conditions that body was exposed to, rather than anything resembling the story implied by decades of tabloid coverage. What actually happened at Dyatlov Pass, then, is not an alien encounter. Not a secret weapons test, not a government cover-up, and not something in artificial intelligence, uncovered by crunching old case files. It is a small, quiet, almost invisible slab of snow set in motion by nothing more sinister than where 9 tired hikers chose to cut a flat spot into a mountainside, striking a tent with just enough force, at just the wrong moment, to turn a difficult but ordinary winter expedition into one of the most enduring mysteries in Russian history. And if that sounds like a smaller, less thrilling ending than aliens or secret experiments, it might be worth sitting with the fact that it isn't smaller at all. 9 people did everything right. They were experienced, they were careful, they read the terrain the way they had been trained to. And the mountains still found the one flaw nobody could have seen coming, in the one place they had disturbed the snow with their own hands. Sometimes the most disturbing answer isn't a conspiracy, it's how little it actually takes. There's something worth remembering here that goes beyond just this one case. For 60 years, silence did more damage to the truth than any single false theory ever could. A government that classified its own investigation for over a decade and closed the case with 4 vague words instead of an actual explanation, effectively guaranteed that imagination would rush in to fill the space it left empty. Every strange detail, the cut tent, the missing tongue, the trace radiation, was real, and every one of them eventually turned out to have an explanation rooted in ordinary, explainable physics, biology, and bad luck rather than anything hidden or sinister. The lesson of Dyatlov Pass may not really be about snow or wind, or even about 9 remarkable young hikers who never made it home. It might be about what happens to the truth when the people responsible for it decide silence is easier than honesty. And how long? How very long. It can take careful, patient science to finally undo the damage that silence leaves behind. What do you think? Does the Avalanche model finally put this one to rest for you? Or does something about that night still not add up? Tell me where you land in the comments. I read everyone.